From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. The world is getting older. As more people retire each year, fewer working-age people will be there to replace them. This has effects not only in the workplace, but in the world of finance. The bond rating agency Moody's says the aging population will lead to a drop in household savings. This could mean that total investments will fall and economic growth could slow. Some reports have described Japan, Italy, and Germany as the world's super-aged nations. That is the name for countries in which at least 20% of the population is at least 65 years old. Elena Dugar is head of Moody's Sovereign Risk Division. She says changes in many populations are taking place quickly. In 5 years, 6 more countries will join the list of super-aged nations, and 34 nations will be super-aged by the year 2030. Elena Dugar says this will have a big influence on labor and savings. Kishore Kulkarni is with the Metropolitan State University of Denver. He says immigration is one way to reduce the effects of an aging population. Older adults spend money differently than younger ones, and experts say the difference affects the economies of countries. But Kishore Kulkarni believes that specialized career training and productivity gains from technology could make up for the drop in the number of workers. He also says that an aging population will be less of a problem in countries where older people are highly valued. And most experts agree that young workers will have to work longer and retire later than today's older workers. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report in Special English. Congressional leaders and the Obama administration began budget negotiations soon after the presidential election. They are trying to avoid what is being called the fiscal cliff, which is a combination of tax increases and budget cuts that could harm the economy. However, a group of wealthy Americans has formed to try to influence those talks. More than 20 members traveled to Washington recently to call on lawmakers to raise taxes on the richest Americans. The group calls itself Patriotic Millionaires. Members have incomes of at least $1 million a year. Their message is simple: tax us more, we can take it. They are worried about the growing gap between rich and middle-class Americans. The group supports President Obama's plan to raise taxes on high-income earners as part of a budget agreement to avoid the fiscal cliff. If an agreement is not reached by the end of this year, taxes will go up for most Americans, and federal spending will go down sharply. The patriotic millionaires believe their taxes need to be raised. They also do not agree with the idea that increasing taxes on those who create jobs means fewer jobs will be created. TJ Zlotnitsky is the head of iControl Systems, a data management company. He is also a member of the group. He says his personal tax rate is not an issue when he decides on hiring workers. The group opposes raising taxes on the middle class, but not high earners, noting it would be bad for the economy. Patriotic Millionaires has more than 200 members across the country. They work in finance, entertainment, technology, and other areas. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. 2009 may be remembered as the year the world avoided an economic depression. In the United States, stock prices sank to their lowest levels in March. But stocks recovered strongly for the year. The S&P 500 index gained over 20%, its largest increase in 6 years. As 2009 ended, the nation's biggest banks rushed to repay money from the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. In October of 2008, Congress approved up to $700 billion to rescue the financial industry. In December, the United States Treasury announced that Wells Fargo and Citibank had repaid $45 billion. They joined Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America in returning government aid. In June, the Treasury permitted the 10 largest banks to return their rescue money and withdraw from TARP. This let banks escape government restrictions on pay for top officials. Now, the government holds a large ownership share in only one big bank, Citigroup. The Treasury says it expects banks to repay $175 billion of TARP money this year. The American car industry also had big problems in 2009. Chrysler and General Motors sought bankruptcy protection from their creditors. The restructured companies may still need government aid, which has already reached over $60 billion. But a government program that paid Americans to trade in old vehicles for new fuel-saving models increased car sales in the summer. The Ford Motor Company refused government aid and is working to become profitable again by 2011. And there are signs that the industry is starting to recover. However, the housing market continues to suffer its worst downturn in generations. Mortgage financer Fannie Mae reports that payments on 5% of its single-family home loans are late. The 10% unemployment rate has meant that many people are struggling with their house payments. Still, consumer confidence grew in December. Experts say Americans were feeling better about the job market and the economy. Growth in the United States is expected to reach about 2.5% in 2010. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report.
I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. The financial crisis of 2008 brought attention to a big problem with banks. Many banks did not have enough money in reserve to protect against their losses. Now, there is a proposed solution. In September, banking supervisors from 26 nations and Hong Kong met in Basel, Switzerland. They announced proposals to make banks safer by requiring them to increase their reserves. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has been working on a set of recommendations known as Basel III. These are based on agreements reached in July by officials from a group of leading industrial nations. The goal is to stop the cycle of easing rules on banks in good times and tightening them only after a crisis. Under the new rules, banks would have to hold reserves equal to 7% of their risk-weighted assets. Mainly, this means loans. Currently, banks are required to hold 2% in reserve. The bigger reserves could be in the form of cash or common stock, also known as common equity. Banks would also have to hold extra reserves as their national economies improve. The new requirements would go into effect starting in January of 2013. Banks would have 5 years to fully meet them. International banking lawyer Ernie Patricus, a former vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, explains why. He says, "We cannot be telling banks on the one hand, raise capital right away, and on the other hand, lend more." One way for banks to meet the proposed new rules would be to sell more of their stock. That is what Germany's Deutsche Bank did in September. It announced a sale offer valued at over $11 billion. Ernie Patricus thinks chief executive officers of banks have 3 choices. He says one is to go out and raise more common equity. Another one is to not pay dividends. And that is not something most CEOs want to do because their shareholders aren't going to be particularly happy. And the third choice is sell assets, downsize the bank. Nations on the Basel Committee will now seek to pass the new rules into law so their banking supervisors can enforce them. Banks that fall below the reserve limits could have to stop paying dividends to shareholders or bonuses to top employees. Ending dividends would anger shareholders, and limiting pay could send bankers fleeing to hedge funds, where there are fewer rules. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Central bankers have to choose their words carefully, so they often say little in public, or little that makes sense. But the United States Central Bank says it is trying to be more clear and timely in communicating its policies. The latest example, a press conference by Chairman Ben Bernanke. The April 27th event was the first of its kind in the 98-year history of the Federal Reserve. In his opening comments, Mr. Bernanke explained a decision by the Federal Open Market Committee to leave its main short-term interest rate near zero. The committee had just completed a 2-day meeting. Mr. Bernanke said, "The committee continues to anticipate that the economic conditions, including low rates of resource utilization, subdued inflation trends, and stable inflation expectations, are likely to warrant exceptionally low levels for the federal funds rate for an extended period." In other words, the economy is not growing fast enough to worry about inflation. A reporter asked what an extended period means to the Fed. Mr. Bernanke said it suggests a couple of meetings probably, but it all depends on the economy. He said it is very hard to blame the American public for being impatient with the speed of the recovery. But he pointed out that unemployment is still high, oil and gasoline prices are high, and the housing market remains very weak. The committee said it will complete purchases of $600 billion in Treasury securities in June. The Fed launched the bond buying program late last year in an effort to keep interest rates low and strengthen the economy. Some economists say this second round of what is known as quantitative easing, or QE2, has not been effective. Mr. Bernanke disagreed and pointed to examples like gains in stock prices. The Fed has two main goals for its monetary policy: the highest possible employment rates and stable prices. The bank faced criticism for intervening either too little to some critics or too much to others in the financial crisis. The press conference produced no surprises, yet as recently as the middle of the 1990s, the Fed did not even release its decisions or its interest rate targets to the public. The Fed announced in March that Mr. Bernanke will hold 4 press briefings a year. The next of 3 planned for this year will follow a decision on interest rates in June. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. European Union officials agreed on a debt rescue plan in May. They also got a message from Britain's new governing parties. William Hague, the new British Foreign Secretary, said, "It was not difficult to agree between us that neither party is in favor of handing any more powers to the European Union." In the British elections, the Conservatives won the most seats in Parliament, but not a majority. So they and the Liberal Democrats formed Britain's first coalition government since World War II. Gordon Brown resigned as Prime Minister. His Labour Party held power for 13 years, the last 3 under him. In his place moves David Cameron of the Conservative Party. At 43, he is Britain's youngest head of government since 1812. Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats is his deputy. Their new government will have to deal with Britain's own debt crisis. The budget deficit is about 12% of the economy. David Cameron has promised $9 billion in budget cuts as a start. Both parties agreed to make no proposal for Britain to join the 16 countries that use the euro. Markets eased after the announcement of a nearly $1 trillion rescue plan. It involves loans, debt guarantees, and other support to euro area countries with heavy debts. Some of the money will come from the International Monetary Fund. The EU Monetary Affairs Commissioner said the debt crisis is a serious threat. The crisis in Greece has threatened to spread to other countries and has led to protests and violence over spending cuts. But now, interest rates for borrowing by troubled countries like Greece and Portugal have fallen sharply. Many people blame the Greek crisis for the sudden drop in American stock markets in May. It may have played a part, but officials told Congress they were still investigating the causes of the so-called flash crash. Major stock exchanges have agreed to develop a plan to prevent a disorderly market like that again. The idea is to slow trading in a coordinated way. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 1,000 points in minutes, then largely recovered. The plunge renewed debate about the risks of electronic exchanges and high-speed computer trading systems. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. You can comment on this report at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The British bank Standard Chartered agreed to pay $340 million to a United States financial regulator in August. The agreement was to settle charges that the bank illegally hid financial business with Iranian interests. The wording of the agreement notes that the financial business in question amounted to at least $250 billion. Standard Chartered said it strongly rejects the charges. The bank said it will fight efforts to withdraw its license to do business in New York, an important financial center. Standard Chartered is Britain's fifth largest bank. New York State's top bank regulator accused the bank of being a rogue institution from 2001 to 2010. The regulator said the bank made hundreds of millions of dollars in fees from about 60,000 financial exchanges with Iranian financial institutions. The reported exchanges were made through the bank's New York offices. One official said the dealings exposed the United States banking system to terrorists, illegal drug traffickers, and rogue states. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation is carrying out a criminal investigation. Other United States regulators also have opened investigations and are not part of the settlement. United States law has tightly controlled financial dealings with Iran since 1979. That year, 52 Americans were taken hostage in Tehran for 444 days. But Western concerns about Iran's possible nuclear program are central to the case. Bank expert Bert Elley told VOA that the investigation is part of an effort by several Western countries to limit Iran's nuclear program. They accuse Iran of trying to develop a nuclear weapon. He said enforcement of the Bank Secrecy Act and other laws is part of an effort by financial officials to cut off money flows to Iran. This is to make it as difficult as possible for Iran to sell its oil around the world and to buy equipment and parts for nuclear enrichment activities. Standard Chartered is not the only British bank that has faced fines recently. Barclays agreed to pay fines of about $450 million to American and British officials in July. Barclays is one of 18 banks that set an important measure of borrowing costs for banks, the London Interbank Offering Rate, or LIBOR. Officials said Barclays lied to them about its interest costs. This made the bank appear stronger than it was. But LIBOR is used to set many interest rates paid by millions of people around the world. For VOA Special English, I'm Mario Ritter.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Burma is in a good position to make big gains in Asia's fast-growing markets. But development must include all of society and be sustainable for Burma to reach its goals. That is what the Asian Development Bank said in a recent report. Sin Yoon Park is an economist with the bank. She says Burma's economic position is strengthened by its natural resources such as oil, gas, and minerals. It also has two large and growing neighbors, India and China. And the nation is young. 1 in 4 of its citizens are under the age of 30. But Burma has a long way to go. After 50 years of military rule, it is one of Asia's poorest countries. Basic infrastructure like roads, bridges, and railways are not developed, and only 30% of rural people have electricity. Burma is trying to increase foreign investment. Its civilian government has struggled with a new foreign investment law. Some versions of the law restricted foreign ownership in some industries and ban it completely in others. Sean Turnell is an economist with Australia's Macquarie University. He said the foreign investment law faced local disapproval or pushback. He said in some cases there appears to be a walling off of some industries to foreigners. For years, Burma's military closely controlled the economy. Relatives and friends of military members received rich contracts. Now, the civilian government wants to expand services and manufacturing. It has considered giving foreign companies low tax rates so they will invest. But experts say this could be a mistake. Sean Turnell says investors are concerned about infrastructure problems, not taxes. Economists also say tax breaks for local businesses may not be the answer either. They say the lack of access to credit for farmers and businesses in Burma is a bigger problem. Reform in Burma is still in the early stages. The country recently announced new rules ending direct government censorship of news media. Reporters now must send censors their work after it is published instead of before. Some reporters say they will wait to see if this means more freedom. Sin Yoon Park says investors too are waiting to see if reform will succeed. It is really going to take a while, she says, before the investors do believe that this reform is sincere and the government is not going to retrench. For VOA Special English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Business is the most popular subject for international students in the United States. At last count, 22% of foreign students at American colleges and universities were studying business and management. The Institute of International Education in New York says engineering was the second most popular field. Thomas Kosei is a professor of marketing and business at the University of Richmond in Virginia. He says international students who want to study business need to have good English skills. At the same time, native English speakers who work with foreign companies may need to learn some new communication skills themselves. This is because the world has more non-native speakers of English than native speakers. At the University of Richmond, teams of graduate students work with companies seeking to enter the American market. The students learn about writing market entry studies. The reports are written in English. But Professor Kosei tells his students to consider who will read them. He said his students have to write the report so that it can be understood by someone who is an English speaker but not a native English speaker. For example, he tells his students to avoid jargon and other specialized terms that people might not know in their own language. This can be good advice even when writing for other native speakers. But effective communication involves more than just words. Kay Westerfield is director of the International Business Communication Program at the University of Oregon. She says you must have the language skills as well as cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence means the need to consider local behaviors in everything from simple handshakes to speaking to large groups. Still, Kay Westerfield says the ability of foreign workers to speak English is becoming more important to companies looking to off-source operations to other countries. Also, she says English skills often provide a competitive edge for business students when they seek jobs. She said, as one business student in West Africa put it, English is a lifeline. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. We offer live English lessons Monday through Friday at the VOA Learning English page on Facebook. You can also read and listen to our programs and find activities for English learners at voaspecialenglish.com. And we have podcasts on iTunes. I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. Business is the most popular subject for international students in the United States. At last count, 21% of foreign students at American colleges and universities were studying business and management. The Institute of International Education in New York says engineering is the second most popular field, in case you were wondering. Thomas Kosei is a professor of marketing and business at the University of Richmond in Virginia. He says international students who want to study business need to have good English skills and not just to study at his school. But the world has more non-native speakers of English than native speakers. As a result, Americans working with foreign companies may need to learn some new English skills themselves. At the University of Richmond, teams of graduate students work with companies seeking to enter the American market. The students learn about writing market entry studies. The reports are written in English, but Professor Kosei tells his students to consider who will read them. He said his students have to write the report so that it can be understood by someone who is an English speaker but not a native English speaker. For example, he tells his students to avoid jargon and other specialized terms that people might not know in their own language. This can be good advice even when writing for other native speakers. But effective communication involves more than just words. Kay Westerfield is director of the International Business Communication Program at the University of Oregon. She says you must have the language skills as well as cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence means the need to consider local behaviors in everything from simple handshakes to speaking to large groups. Still, Kay Westerfield says the ability of foreign workers to speak English is becoming more important to companies looking to move operations to other countries, or, as she puts it, to offsource. Also, she says English skills often provide a competitive edge for business students when they seek jobs. She said, as one business student in West Africa put it, English is a lifeline. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can read and listen to our programs and find activities for English learners at voaspecialenglish.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at VOA Learning English.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. In Britain, demonstrators recently protested outside the Treasury to call on the world's richest countries to act against tax havens. These are countries or territories that have low tax rates for businesses. Companies can place their profits in tax havens to avoid the higher tax rates of countries where they earned the income. An investigation found that tax havens cost Africa $38 billion every year in lost taxes. Former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan led the investigation. The demonstrators at Britain's Treasury called on Chancellor George Osborne to discuss the practice with finance ministers from other wealthy countries. Melanie Ward is with the Enough for Everyone If campaign. She said she believes many people in Britain and the world oppose such tax avoidance. Tax havens and low-tax countries like Ireland are popular, but critics of tax havens say big companies transfer profits out of the countries on which their income depends. Ronan Palan is a professor at City University, London. He says capital in some African countries is funding development in other parts of the world because of such transfers. The charity Action Aid says the brewing company SAB Miller uses a complex system of tax havens. It says this system moves profits out of the company's operations in developing countries like Ghana. SAB Miller denies any tax abuses. It says in 2010 it paid about $250 million in corporate taxes in India and sub-Saharan Africa. British Prime Minister David Cameron has promised to discuss the issue of tax havens at the G8 leaders meeting in June. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.